Chapter 6, Project Time Management. Project time management includes the processes required to manage the time of the completion of the project. It includes planning, schedule management, defining activities, sequencing activities, estimating activity resources and durations, developing the schedule, and then a very important factor would be controlling the schedule. So in the chapter we have the different learning objectives, and I'll ask you to read through them. And I hope you notice that in our the list of objectives, we've changed it a little bit so that some of the objectives we're focusing more on some objectives over others. And then we see here our summarizing the different processes and the outputs that are involved in the project management plan, the project time management part of it. There's the planning, schedule management, which involves determining the policies, procedures, and documentation used for planning, executing, and controlling the project schedule. We're going to define activities. We're going to try to sequence the activities correctly and make network diagrams. Estimate the activity resources involved. Resources, of course, people, equipment, and materials. Estimating the activity duration, the schedule, developing a schedule, and then, of course, controlling the schedules. And those outputs of that would be our project time management plan. Okay. And so we have the components to help us plan the schedule management. Okay. And they include project schedule model development, and we're going to do that with our sort of our assignments. Just to include information about the accuracy and units of measures. Are we going to be in hours, days, or some other unit? Controlling thresholds, variances, rules of performance measurement. For example, the example in the book there is about the team members expecting to track percentage of work completed versus and so we have to focus about how to determine the percentages. Different reporting formats that we use, and then the process description, describing how all the schedule management process will be performed. And then we'll need to define the activities, which involves identifying specific actions that will produce the deliverable. And the outputs of this process include an activity list, activity attributes, a milestone list, and a project management plan update. So we have with these, I'm going to focus on the milestone, I think. I skipped the activity list here, tabulation of activities, activity name, the attributes for the activity, and then there's milestones. And those are the significant part of the schedule that normally have no duration, but are kind of goals, small goals throughout the project. And then we move on to sequencing the events, or sequencing activities. And so we need to define some terminology in terms of 3 types of dependencies. We have mandatory dependencies. For example, that you can't test a code until after the code has been written. Kind of straightforward. Discretionary dependencies, which are defined by the project team. And then external dependencies, relationships between project and non-project activities. And then we have a network diagram trying to sequence the activity. And again, you do have an assignment to create a network diagram. I've asked you to do one in PowerPoint. And network diagrams are schematic displays of the relationships as well as the sequencing. Okay? And the 2 main types of diagrams are using the arrow format, and the other is precedent diagram. And I'm asking you to do, I think, our assignment only. We might have the precedent diagram. But anyway, the network diagram here is actually is a arrow diagramming method, which is also called an activity on arrow. It shows the activity as the letters and the duration with the numbers. And we'll have to later find the critical path, use it to find the critical path. So letters A through J represent activities with their dependencies that are required to complete the project. And the activities come from the work breakdown structure, of course. The arrows represent the activity sequencing or the relationship. And we see that activity A must be done before activity D. Okay, so we do ask you to review that because we are going to do an activity on that. And it does explain how to actually put the diagram together there on pages 229, 230. And then we get to a precedence diagramming method. And that's again a network diagram technique in which the boxes represent activities. And figure 6.3 here illustrates the type of dependencies that can occur among project activities based on it's using the Microsoft Project Help screen. And we have the 4 types of activities, 4 types of dependencies, or the relationships between the activities, which are finish to start, start to start, finish to finish, and start to finish. And figure 6.4 illustrates using the precedence diagramming method. And we notice that the activities are placed inside the boxes. Those boxes represent the nodes on this diagram. And the arrows show the relationship between the activities. Then we move on to estimating activity resources. Of course, resources are our people, machines, and also our materials, people, equipment, and materials. And we need to know, who's involved in the project, how long we have them, and the output of that is going to be a resource breakdown structure. Then we move on to activity duration estimating. And we have to worry about the duration, which includes the actual amount of work, the effort, which is the number of work days or work hours required to complete a task, and then we have knowing which unit we're in. Okay, and that could be one day could be 8 hours, or 8 hours could be so we have to, and we can actually define that in our project 2013. And then we have ways to estimate, as in the 3-point estimate. We can estimate optimistic, most likely, or pessimistic estimation, which you see example would be the ones 3-week, 4-week, or 5-week. And we need the 3-point estimates, so we're going to talk about the PERT chart, and we'll see that in section 6.7K. Okay. We also see it again in chapter 11. So we'll move on to 6.7, section 6.7, which talks about the schedule. Okay, so here we might need to take some time to review this section a little closely, because we're going to have to develop the schedule here. And of course the goal is to create a realistic project schedule. We need to know the start and end date of the project. And some tools we have to help us do that are the Gantt chart, the critical path method, and the PERT analysis. Those are the ones we're going to use. There are others, of course, but those are the ones we're going to use. So Gantt chart is going to provide this a standard format there for us. And we have the black diamonds that are used as milestones, the thick black bars for summary tasks, lighter horizontal bars for durations of the task, and arrows for dependencies between tasks. And there's an example of one there. And we also see here the Gantt chart for the software launch project that's discussed there in the chapter. And this is more sophisticated. It's based on software launch and uses a template from Microsoft, one of their templates. Okay. The activities on the Gantt chart are driven by the deliverables on the work breakdown structure. And they coincide with the activity list and the milestone list. Notice that the Gantt chart for the software launch project contains milestones, summary tasks, individual tasks, and task durations, and arrows showing task dependencies. The thick lines, the diamonds, the horizontal, and the arrows. And the book tells us how to add the milestones, and we want to use the SMART criteria when we're adding milestones, okay? Being specific, and these are just guidelines, of course. Being specific for a task, duration, how measurable, defining something that is measurable, assigning it correctly, being realistic, and also the time frame. And then we're going to figure 6.7 here. We see a tracking Gantt chart, and that compares the planned and actual project schedule information. Then we move to our critical path method to determine if there's slack or float in our schedule. I think I do have you evaluating it, but I think I have you evaluating a critical path based on our network diagram here. Okay. And the book does explain how to use that. And then we're moving on to our PERT chart, 6.7K, which is another type of network analysis, program evaluation and review technique, PERT, P-E-R-T, network analysis. And it uses the probabilistic time estimates when we talked about having the three estimates, the pessimistic, optimistic, and our most likely estimates. And that's what's used on the PERT chart. And we have different weights to help us estimate. We calculate a weighted average for the duration of each project. And as you have see there the formula on how to do that. And I think I asked you to work on some of those. And of course the opening case used the PERT to determine the schedule also, you may recall. And there's an example of the same example is in your book there on page 247. And then, of course, the agile and time management. Of course, we're very concerned with time when we're looking at the agile method. And then we're moving on to our controlling the schedule. And we have to consider that the goal, of course, is to know how the status of the schedule, the influence of the schedule, influencing factors, that cause the schedule to change. Determine that it has changed and manage those changes. So it's important to control the schedule. We know changes are inevitable. And then, and sometimes they'll be small, sometimes they'll be big. But we should expect some sort of change and be aware of it and then manage it. And some tools that help us with these considerations are a progress report, regular meetings, and we can get a report knowing how things are moving along. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 7. And then working with people, making sure that that we are good leaders. And that's why we said initially we have to have our executive power supporting us, or that makes us useless also. So we're going to have some good leadership. Strong is the word we're using here. Strong leadership, not just charts, okay, but strong leadership. And then we also need to motivate our team, whether that's giving them power, whether that's incentivizing them, whether that's being disciplinary, which usually doesn't work so well, but mostly negotiation. And then the last section, of course, talks about the software that we might use. And, of course, we're going to use Microsoft Project. I think we use something else for this in this chapter, too, another software. Maybe not. And we're also going to, but as you've seen, we can use other tools. But what I'll point out here, though, is that not everybody knows how to use software, and it can be misused. And you also have to enter dependencies with dates to determine your critical path. And then you have to enter the schedule information to compare your plan and actual. So it brings us to the end of the chapter there. And we focus on planning schedule management, defining activities, sequencing the activities, estimating the resources and durations. Then we develop the schedule, and then most importantly, we have to control that schedule. But of course, we have the schedule developed before we can control anything. Okay, so again, we have the opening vignettes, which are going to help us understand about the management, it's the importance of managing time. And then we have a couple of activities that are for the Dropbox. We do individually. I did have an example of one on there for you. And then we're going to do a couple of group activities, which are the from the running case. And I have asked you to make a video, again, a video of, instead of writing the papers, to make a video, and the others are defined there. I think it's a video that encompasses all of those 1 through 4. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm here to help you. Thank you.